December 1944. The sky over England was the colour of cold steel, thick clouds pressing down like a weight on everyone's shoulders. At RAF Debden, northeast of London, the air was sharp with tension and the smell of aviation fuel. Inside the operations room, Flight Lieutenant James Hartford stood frozen, staring at the red stamp across the mission briefing. Cancelled. The mission they had prepared for 3 weeks, the one that could change the course of the war in Western Europe, was over before it began. A single severed communication wire had made it impossible for command to coordinate with ground forces. Without that coordination, sending bombers into enemy territory would be suicide. James felt his chest tighten. 23 years old, with dark circles under his eyes from countless sleepless nights, he had joined the Royal Air Force, believing he could make a difference. Now, standing in that cold room with peeling paint on the walls and maps covered in red marks indicating enemy positions, he felt utterly powerless. If you're enjoying this story of courage and ingenuity during one of history's darkest hours, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more incredible true stories to light. The mission was supposed to target a critical German supply depot near the Belgian border. Intelligence reports confirmed that enemy forces were stockpiling ammunition and fuel there, preparing for a major counter-offensive. If they succeeded, Allied advancement could be set back by months. Thousands of lives hung in the balance. But the wire, that cursed wire. James walked out of the operations room, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. Outside, the December wind cut through his flight jacket. Mechanics worked on the Lancaster bombers lined up on the runway, their propellers still, waiting for orders that would never come. The men knew. You could see it in their faces, in the way they moved, slower now, defeated. Sergeant Peter Morrison approached, wiping grease from his hands with an oil-stained rag. Peter was 42, old enough to be James's father, with a weathered face that had seen too many friends die in this war. He had been a telephone engineer in Manchester before the war, working for the post office, running lines across the city. "Lieutenant," Peter said, his voice rough from years of smoking. "I heard about the mission." James nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He looked at the grey sky, searching for words that wouldn't come. "It's the communication line, isn't it?" Peter asked. "The one to ground command in Belgium." "Severed somewhere between here and Dover," James said, his voice hollow. "They can't coordinate with our forces on the ground. Without confirmation of enemy positions and civilian evacuations, we can't go. We'd be flying blind." Peter was quiet for a moment, looking at the bombers. "How long to get a new line installed?" "Command says 48 hours minimum. By then, the Germans will have moved the supplies. The intelligence will be worthless." 48 hours, Peter repeated, shaking his head. "In 48 hours, how many boys you reckon will die because we couldn't stop that supply line?" James didn't answer. He already knew. The intelligence officers had been clear during the briefing. Every day they delayed, the enemy grew stronger. British and American troops were pushing through Belgium, fighting for every mile. They needed air support. They needed this mission. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of distant thunder, or maybe it was artillery from across the channel. It was hard to tell anymore. "I need to check something," Peter said suddenly. "Come with me, Lieutenant." They walked to the communications building, a low structure near the control tower. Inside, the walls were lined with radio equipment, telegraph machines, and complex wiring systems that connected the airfield to command centers across Britain and occupied Europe. 2 radio operators sat at their stations, headphones on. But there was nothing to communicate. The mission was cancelled. Peter moved to a large diagram on the wall showing the communication network. His finger traced the line from Debden to Dover, then across the channel to Belgium. "Here's where I think the break is," he said, pointing to a section near the coast. "Storm damage, probably. Lightning strike or a tree falling on the line." They already checked, James said. They can't locate it quickly enough, and even if they could, splicing a military-grade communication line isn't something you can do in an hour. Peter turned to look at him, and there was something in the older man's eyes that James hadn't seen before. A spark. A mad, desperate kind of hope. "What if we didn't splice it?" Peter said. "What do you mean? What if we bypassed it entirely, used a different route?" James frowned. "There is no different route. That's the only secure military line to Belgium." "Not military," Peter said, moving to a different map, this one showing civilian infrastructure. "But before the war, the post office had communication lines running all through Kent and into Dover. Some of them connected to underwater cables that ran to France and Belgium for commercial use. Those lines are ancient," James said, "probably damaged or disconnected." "Some, yeah, but not all. I worked on that system, Lieutenant. I know it like the back of my hand." Peter's voice grew more urgent. "If I can get to Dover and access the old post office exchange there, I might be able to jury-rig a connection using the civilian lines. It won't be pretty, and it won't be secure, but it could work long enough to coordinate the mission." James stared at him. "That's insane." "Probably. You're talking about rebuilding an entire communication network in a few hours, using equipment that's been sitting unused for years." "I've done crazier things," Peter said, though his hands trembled slightly. "Look, Lieutenant, I'm not a hero. I'm just a mechanic who used to run telephone wires. But I know how to do this. Give me a chance." "Do you?" James looked around the communications room, at the silent equipment, at the operators with nothing to do. Outside, through the window, he could see the bombers waiting on the runway. He thought about the men who would die if they didn't fly this mission. He thought about the German supply depot, about enemy soldiers loading ammunition, preparing to kill Allied troops. "How many men do you need?" James asked. 2, 3 at most. Men who know their way around electrical work. And transportation. Fast vehicle to Dover. Then I need access to the old post office building there. It's probably locked up tighter than a drum." James made a decision that could end his career or save hundreds of lives. Possibly both. "Give me 10 minutes, he said. He went straight to Wing Commander Harrison's office. Geoffrey Harrison was 56, a veteran of the First World War, with a permanent limp from a crash landing in France in 1918. He sat behind his desk, looking older than his years, reading reports that probably said the same thing over and over. Mission cancelled, men dying, war dragging on. "Sir," James said, standing at attention, "I have a proposal." Harrison looked up, his grey eyes tired. "Unless your proposal involves fixing a severed communication line in the next hour, Hartford, I don't want to hear it." "That's exactly what it involves, sir." Harrison put down his papers. "Explain." James told him everything Peter had said. As he spoke, he watched the wing commander's face, trying to read his reaction. Harrison was known for being by the book, for following orders precisely. But he was also known for caring deeply about his men. When James finished, Harrison was quiet for a long time. Outside his window, mechanics were already beginning to drain fuel from the bombers, preparing to stand them down. "This sergeant of yours," Harrison said finally. "Morrison. You trust him?" "With my life, sir." "You might be trusting him with a lot more than that. If this fails, if we send bombers up based on a jury-rigged civilian communication system and something goes wrong, men will die. Good men. Men are dying now, sir. Every minute we wait." Harrison stood up, walked to his window. He watched the mechanics work for a moment, then turned back to James. "You understand that if I authorize this, and it goes wrong, both our careers are over." "Court-martial territory." "Yes, sir. And you understand that even if it works, we're violating about a dozen regulations by using civilian infrastructure for military operations." "Yes, sir." Harrison smiled grimly. "You know what the problem with this war is, Hartford. Too many rules, too much bureaucracy. Sometimes you need men willing to break the rules to do what's right. He moved to his desk, scribbled something on a piece of paper. Take this authorization. Get Morrison whatever he needs. You have until 1600 hours. If the line isn't operational by then, the mission is scrubbed permanently. James took the paper, his hand shaking slightly. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. And Hartford, if this works, I'm putting both of you up for commendations. If it doesn't work, I never signed that paper. Understood? Understood, sir. 20 minutes later, James and Peter were in a military transport truck racing toward Dover, accompanied by two young engineers, Corporals Davies and Mitchell, both barely 20 years old, but with steady hands and sharp minds. The truck bounced along roads damaged by years of war, passing through villages where people lived in the shadow of constant fear. Peter sat in the passenger seat, a notebook in his lap, sketching out circuit diagrams and connection points. His hands moved quickly, confidently, despite the bouncing of the truck. The main challenge, he explained to James, who was driving, is that the civilian lines weren't designed for military-grade encryption or signal strength. We'll need to boost the signal, probably with some of the portable radio equipment from the truck, and we'll need to find a clean connection point where the lines aren't too corroded. And if they are corroded, James asked, swerving to avoid a crater in the road. Then we improvise, Peter said grimly. They reached Dover just after noon. The coastal town was heavily fortified, with anti-aircraft guns pointing toward France and barbed wire along the beaches. The white cliffs that had once been a symbol of English pride now looked grey and forbidding under the overcast sky. The old post office building stood near the town centre, a Victorian brick structure that looked like it had been closed since the start of the war. The windows were boarded up, and the door was secured with a heavy chain and padlock. "Davies, Mitchell," James called. "Get that door open. Morrison, what do you need me to do?" "Find the local commander. We'll need access to any underground cable runs they might know about, and see if there's a Telegraph Hill station still operational anywhere in town." James found the local military commander, a Captain Williams, who looked skeptical about the whole operation, but provided maps of pre-war infrastructure and a set of keys to various municipal buildings. By the time he returned to the post office, Peter and the two corporals had forced the door open and were inside, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The main exchange room was on the second floor, accessed by a narrow staircase that creaked under their weight. Inside, James found walls covered with old telephone equipment, massive switchboards, and tangles of coloured wires that meant nothing to him, but seemed to speak volumes to Peter. "Beautiful," Peter whispered, running his hands over an old junction box. "This is all copper wiring, pre-war standard. If the underground cables are intact, we might actually pull this off." He moved quickly, opening access panels, testing circuits with a small multimeter he'd brought from the airfield. Davies and Mitchell worked under his direction, stripping wires, making connections, their young faces tight with concentration. "Here's the problem," Peter said after 20 minutes. "The line to Belgium was connected through here, but someone disconnected it properly when the war started. Standard security procedure. We need to reconnect it and boost the signal, but the switching equipment is all manual. We'll need someone here to maintain the connection throughout the mission." "How long?" James asked. "Hour and a half, maybe 2. We'd need someone who knows what they're doing to stay here and keep adjusting the signal strength as it fluctuates." "I'll stay," Davies said immediately. "I worked at a telephone exchange before I enlisted. I can handle it." Peter looked at the young corporal, evaluating him. "You sure?" "Yes, Sergeant." "All right then. Let's get to work." They worked for the next hour in intense focus. Peter traced circuits, Davies soldered connections. Mitchell ran up and down stairs carrying equipment from the truck. James made call after call to the airfield, updating Wing Commander Harrison on their progress. At 14:30 hours, with sweat running down his face despite the cold building, Peter made the final connection and stepped back. "Try it now," he said to Davies. The corporal activated the line, adjusted several switches, and listened on an old telephone handset. His face lit up. "I've got something. Signal's weak, but it's there." Peter grabbed a radio unit they'd modified, connected it to the circuit, and began transmitting. "Debden operations, this is Morrison Field Unit. Do you copy?" Static filled the room. Then, crackling and faint but unmistakable, a voice came through. "Morrison Field Unit, this is Debden operations. We copy. Signal strength weak, but readable." Peter looked at James, his weathered face breaking into a smile for the first time in months. "It works." James grabbed the radio. "Debden, this is Hartford. Connect us to Belgium Ground Command. We need verification of their reception." More waiting, more static. James felt his heart hammering in his chest. If the connection didn't reach all the way to Belgium, if the underground cables were damaged anywhere along the route, this was all for nothing. Then another voice, speaking with an American accent. "This is Major Patterson, U.S. 5th Army Ground Command, currently operating near Liège, Belgium. Who am I speaking to?" "Major, this is Flight Lieutenant Hartford, RAF Debden. We need to verify target coordinates and civilian evacuation status for Operation Sledgehammer." "Hartford, I've been trying to reach you people for 3 hours. Where the hell have you been?" "Long story, sir. Are you in position to provide confirmation for our bombing run?" "Affirmative. Enemy supply depot is confirmed active. Civilian areas have been evacuated within a 5-kilometer radius. We are ready for air support at your earliest convenience." James felt relief wash over him like cold water. "Roger that, Major. Stand by for aircraft arrival. Estimated time on target, 90 minutes. He switched frequencies back to Debden. "Operations, this is Hartford. We have a working line to Belgium. Repeat, we have a working line. Mission is go." Wing Commander Harrison's voice came through, controlled but with an undercurrent of excitement. "Hartford, are you absolutely certain that line will hold for the duration of the mission?" James looked at Peter, who was already checking connections, tightening screws, making sure everything was secure. The sergeant nodded. "Yes, sir. We'll have a man maintaining the line throughout. It's not pretty, but it will work." "Then Godspeed, Lieutenant. Get back here. We're launching in 45 minutes. The drive back to Debden was faster than the trip out. James pushed the truck to its limits, racing through the countryside while Peter sat beside him, exhausted but satisfied. Mitchell dozed in the back, worn out from the physical labor. They reached the airfield at 15:20 hours. The scene had completely transformed. Where before there had been defeat and resignation, now there was controlled chaos, the organized fury of men preparing for war. Fuel trucks raced between bombers. Armament crews loaded 1,000-pound bombs. Pilots ran through pre-flight checks. James jumped out of the truck and ran to the operations room. Inside, Wing Commander Harrison stood with a group of pilots and navigators, going through final briefings. "Hartford," Harrison called, "just in time. You're leading the second formation." "Sir? Did you think I'd send you out there without letting you see this through? Get to your aircraft. Briefing in 2 minutes." James grabbed his flight gear and ran to his Lancaster bomber. The crew was already aboard, running through checks. His navigator, Flying Officer Thomas Webb, looked at him with a mixture of relief and concern. "Heard what you did, James," Webb said. "Either you're brilliant or completely mad." "Probably both," James replied, climbing into the pilot's seat. The familiar smell of oil and leather and metal surrounded him. His hands moved automatically over the controls, checking fuel pressure, engine temperature, control surfaces. Peter Morrison appeared at the aircraft door, breathless from running. "Lieutenant, Davies is maintaining the line in Dover. He knows what to do. Signals holding strong." "Thank you, Peter, for everything." The older man smiled. "Just bring these boys home safe, sir. That's all the thanks I need." The engines roared to life, 4 massive radial engines that made the entire aircraft shake. James went through the startup sequence, feeling the bomber respond to his commands. On either side of him, other Lancasters were starting up, their propellers spinning into blurred circles. Wing Commander Harrison's voice came through the radio. "All aircraft, this is Debden Control. Weather over target is clear. Enemy fighters are active but scattered. Ground forces are in position and have confirmed all civilian evacuations complete. This is important, gentlemen. This mission could save countless Allied lives. Give them hell." James advanced the throttles, feeling the Lancaster surge forward. The bomber picked up speed, racing down the runway, the weight of bombs and fuel pressing it toward the earth. At the critical moment, he pulled back on the yoke, and the aircraft lifted, climbing into the grey English sky. 16 bombers formed up over the airfield, circling in precise formations. James could see the other pilots through their cockpit windows, men he had flown with for months, men who trusted each other with their lives. They turned southeast, heading toward Belgium and the enemy. The flight across the Channel was tense. German fighters had been active in the area, and everyone's eyes scanned the sky for the black crosses of Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs. But the sky remained empty except for Allied aircraft. As they crossed into Belgian airspace, James activated the radio link to Ground Command. The connection Peter had jury-rigged was holding, though the signal crackled with static. "Ground Command, this is Sledgehammer Leader. We are crossing into Belgian airspace. Confirm target location." "Sledgehammer Leader, target is confirmed at coordinates 50.63 north, 5.57 east. Weather clear. Winds from northwest at 15 knots. No changes to target status." Webb worked his navigation instruments, calculating their approach. "Target in sight. 2 minutes." James peered through the cockpit window. Below, the Belgian countryside spread out in winter brown and grey. Small towns, bare trees, roads marked by military vehicles. And there, ahead, a cluster of buildings surrounded by earthworks and camouflage netting, the German supply depot. "Bomb bay doors open," James commanded. The Lancaster shuddered as the bay doors swung wide. James lined up the approach, holding the bomber steady despite the turbulence and his own pounding heart. This was it. Everything they had worked for, everything Peter had risked, came down to the next 60 seconds. "Bombs away," the bombardier announced. James felt the aircraft lurch upward as thousands of pounds of explosives fell toward the target. He banked hard left, the prescribed evasion maneuver, and looked back. Other bombers were dropping their loads now, a rain of destruction falling on the supply depot. The first explosions were massive, fireballs rising into the air as ammunition stores detonated. Secondary explosions followed one after another as the bombs found fuel depots and munitions caches. Black smoke billowed up, visible for miles. "Direct hits," Webb reported. "Target is completely destroyed." Ground Command came through the radio, the American major's voice excited. "Sledgehammer Leader, we have visual confirmation. Target is eliminated. Outstanding work, gentlemen. Outstanding." James allowed himself a moment of relief. Then he focused on getting his crew home safely. German anti-aircraft fire was starting to fill the sky, black puffs of flak that could tear an aircraft apart. He pushed the throttles forward, gaining speed, weaving through the defensive fire. One Lancaster took a hit, trailing smoke, but managed to maintain altitude. Another reported engine damage, but stayed in formation. James counted aircraft as they formed up for the return flight. 15 bombers, all accounted for, all heading home. The flight back seemed shorter. The tension gradually eased as they crossed back over the Channel, seeing the English coast appear through the clouds. James felt exhaustion settling over him like a heavy blanket, the adrenaline wearing off, leaving him hollow and shaking. They landed at Debden just as the sun was setting, painting the clouds orange and red. One by one, the Lancasters touched down, their tires squealing on the runway, engines winding down. Ground crews rushed to meet each aircraft, counting heads, checking for damage. James climbed out of his bomber on legs that felt like rubber. Peter Morrison was there, along with Wing Commander Harrison and what seemed like half the base personnel. "Perfect execution," Harrison said, his stern face breaking into a rare smile. "Ground forces report the supply depot is completely destroyed. Intelligence estimates we've set back German operations in that sector by at least 2 weeks, possibly more. Lives saved, Hartford. Countless lives saved." James shook his head. "It wasn't me, sir. It was Morrison. He's the one who made it possible." Harrison turned to Peter, who stood at attention, uncomfortable with the attention. "Sergeant Morrison, I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Medal. What you did today showed extraordinary initiative and technical skill under pressure, the kind of thing that wins wars." Peter's face flushed. "Sir, I just did what needed doing. Any telephone engineer could have—" "Any telephone engineer wasn't here," Harrison interrupted. "You were. You saw what needed to happen and made it happen. That's the definition of heroism." That evening in the mess hall, the pilots and crew celebrated with whatever food and drink they could scrounge up. It wasn't much, wartime rations being what they were, but the mood was jubilant. Men who had been defeated that morning now laughed and told stories, reliving the mission, each account growing slightly more dramatic. James found Peter sitting alone near a window, looking out at the darkened airfield. He joined him, carrying 2 cups of terrible coffee. "You all right?" James asked. Peter took the coffee gratefully. "Just thinking about Davies, young lad, holding that line for 2 hours straight in a cold building in Dover. He's the real hero today." "There were a lot of heroes today," James said, "including you." "I keep thinking about what might have happened if that wire trick hadn't worked," Peter said quietly. "All those men flying into danger based on a connection I cobbled together from 40-year-old post office equipment. What if it had failed mid-mission? But it didn't. But it could have." James was quiet for a moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. "That's war, Peter. Every decision we make, every mission we fly, it could fail. Men could die. But we have to try anyway, because not trying means certain death for someone else. You understood that. You took the risk because the alternative was worse." Peter nodded slowly. "My dad was a telephone engineer too. Did I ever tell you that? Worked his whole life running wires, connecting people. Used to say that every connection matters. Every voice that gets through might be important. Never thought I'd prove him right quite so dramatically." They sat in comfortable silence, drinking bad coffee, listening to the sounds of celebration around them. The celebration continued around them, but both men felt the weight of what they had accomplished settling onto their shoulders. It wasn't the easy weight of pride, but something more complex, more profound. They had saved lives today, but tomorrow those same lives would be at risk again. The war machine never stopped grinding. James looked at Peter's hands, stained with oil and copper oxidation, trembling slightly now that the adrenaline had worn off. These were the hands that had made the impossible possible, that had connected wires and circuits in a cold Dover building while bombers waited on runways and men held their breath hoping for a miracle. "Your hands are shaking," James observed quietly. Peter looked down at them, almost surprised. "Yeah, they do that sometimes. Started after Dunkirk. I was one of the boat operators bringing boys back from the beach. Saw things no one should see. Thought I'd left the war behind when they assigned me to mechanics, but I guess the war follows you wherever you go. You were at Dunkirk?" "Don't like to talk about it much," Peter said, taking another sip of coffee. "But yeah. 3 days on a fishing trawler, going back and forth across the channel while German planes strafed us. Lost a lot of good men. Watched them slip under the water because we couldn't reach them in time. After that, I figured if I could help from the ground, working on engines and equipment, maybe I could make up for the ones I couldn't save. James felt a new respect for the man beside him. Peter Morrison wasn't just a skilled engineer who had saved the day with clever thinking. He was a man who had stared death in the face and kept coming back, kept finding ways to fight, kept using his skills to save others. "You saved more than you lost today," James said. "Maybe," Peter replied. "But the ones you lose never really leave you, do they? Every wire I connect, every engine I fix, I'm thinking about those boys in the water, thinking about how every little thing matters. One bad connection, one loose wire, and someone doesn't come home. That's why I couldn't just let today's mission get cancelled. I kept seeing faces in my mind, boys who'd die if we didn't give them air support. Couldn't let that happen. Not if there was anything I could do about it." The conversation was interrupted by Corporal Mitchell, who approached their table with a telegram in his hand. His young face was serious, unusual for the usually cheerful 20-year-old. "Lieutenant, this just came through from command," Mitchell said, handing over the paper. James read it quickly, his expression darkening. Peter noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" Peter asked. "Intelligence intercept. The Germans are moving more supplies into the region, faster than expected. They're trying to rebuild what we destroyed. Command wants another strike day after tomorrow. Bigger operation this time, more bombers, hitting multiple targets simultaneously." "Can they coordinate it?" Peter asked. "With the regular communication lines?" "They're working on it, but it'll be tight. The military line won't be fully repaired for at least a week. They're asking if our jury-rigged system can handle multiple simultaneous transmissions from different aircraft formations." Peter was quiet for a moment, thinking. His engineer's mind was already working through the problem, calculating signal strength, bandwidth, potential interference patterns. "It wasn't designed for that," he said slowly. "The civilian infrastructure, those old post office lines, they were meant for sequential communications, not parallel data streams. If we try to push too much through at once, the signal could degrade, or worse, we could get crosstalk between formations. Pilots could receive incorrect coordinates, incorrect target confirmations. So it's impossible," James said flatly. "I didn't say that," Peter replied, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. "I said it wasn't designed for that, but with the right modifications, some additional relay stations, maybe splitting the signal through multiple junction points, it might be possible." "Might. That's a big word, Lieutenant. How big a might are we talking about? 60-40. Maybe 70-30 if everything goes perfect, but perfect doesn't happen much in war." James stood up, decision made. "Let's go talk to Wing Commander Harrison. If you think there's a chance, we have to try." They found Harrison in his office, still working despite the late hour. The Wing Commander looked up as they entered, his expression weary but alert. "Hartford, Morrison, I was just about to send for you. I assume you've seen the orders." "Yes, sir," James replied. "Morrison thinks he might be able to modify the system to handle multiple formations, but it's risky." Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Peter carefully. "Define risky." "Sir, the system I built was barely adequate for today's operation. It worked because we had a single point of communication, one bomber formation, talking to one ground command station. For a multi-target operation with several formations operating independently, we'd need to expand the network significantly. More junction points, more relay stations, more men maintaining the connections. And even then, there's significant risk of signal degradation or interference." "What would you need?" Harrison asked. "More men, at least 6 experienced with telephone systems. Access to every functional post office exchange between here and the channel. Portable radio equipment, spare parts, probably 36 hours of work minimum. And even then, sir, I can't guarantee it will work." Harrison was silent, tapping his fingers on the desk. Outside his window, the night was complete, the airfield lit only by scattered lamps and the glow of cigarettes from men who couldn't sleep. "The stakes are higher this time," Harrison said finally. "Command is planning to hit 5 separate supply depots and 2 rail junctions simultaneously. If we can pull it off, we could effectively cut off German supply lines through the entire sector. But if it fails, if there's confusion over targets or timing, we could have bombers hitting the wrong coordinates, possibly even friendly positions." "I understand the stakes, sir," Peter said. "Do you?" Harrison stood up, moving to a map on his wall. Red pins marked enemy positions, blue pins marked Allied forces. "Because I'm not sure you do. If today's mission had failed, we would have lost an opportunity. If this mission fails, we could lose hundreds of men to friendly fire or German anti-aircraft batteries. The difference between success and catastrophic failure is the reliability of your jury-rigged communication system." Peter met Harrison's gaze steadily. "Sir, I've been building and maintaining communication systems for 25 years. I know my limitations, and I know what I can and can't do. What I'm proposing is at the very edge of possible. But I've also learned that sometimes the edge of possible is exactly where you need to be to win a war. Give me the men and equipment, give me the time, and I'll build you a system that works. I can't promise perfection, but I can promise I'll give you the best chance of success that's humanly possible." Harrison studied the older man for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "All right. You've got your men and equipment. But Morrison, understand this. If this goes wrong, it's not just your career that ends, it's mine too. And more importantly, it's men's lives. I need you to be absolutely certain you can do this." "I'm certain I can try, sir," Peter said. "And I'm certain that if there's anyone who can make it work, it's me and my team. Beyond that, all I can offer is my word that I'll do everything in my power to ensure success." "That's good enough," Harrison said. "You have until 0600 the day after tomorrow. Get it done." The next 36 hours were a blur of frantic activity. Peter assembled a team of 6 men, all with backgrounds in telephone or electrical work. Among them was Corporal Davies, brought back from Dover, where he'd been maintaining the original connection. The young man looked tired but determined, proud to be chosen for the expanded operation. They spread out across Kent and Sussex, accessing every old post office building they could find, testing lines, making connections, building a web of communication that stretched from the airfield to the coast and beyond. Peter himself moved between locations in a military transport, checking each junction point, making adjustments, solving problems that arose. James watched from the airfield as Peter's team worked through the night. The operations room had been transformed into a nerve center, with multiple radio sets connected to Peter's network, each one carefully labeled with formation designations and target coordinates. It looked chaotic, like something assembled by madmen, but Peter insisted there was method in the madness. On the morning of the mission, Peter returned to the airfield, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His uniform was covered in dust and grease, his eyes were bloodshot, but there was satisfaction in his expression. "It's done," he announced to James. 5 junction points, 3 relay stations, 7 men maintaining connections across the network. Signal strength is adequate for all planned transmissions. We've tested each circuit multiple times. It should work." "Should?" James asked. "Should," Peter confirmed. "That's the best I can offer. But, Lieutenant, in all my years of working with communication systems, I've never seen anything quite like what we've built. It's part telephone network, part radio relay, part pure improvisation. If it works, it'll be because a bunch of skilled men are all doing their jobs perfectly at the same time. If it fails, it'll be because we pushed technology beyond its design limits." James put a hand on Peter's shoulder. "Then let's make sure everyone does their job perfectly." Get some rest. We launch in 3 hours. Can't rest, Peter said. I need to be in the main communications room, monitoring signal strength, ready to make adjustments if necessary. Davies and the others are at the junction points. If anything starts to fail, I need to be here to compensate. The briefing room was packed with pilots, navigators, bombardiers and gunners. 23 bombers would fly this mission, divided into 5 formations, each targeting a different site. The complexity was unprecedented. Wing Commander Harrison stood before the assembled crews, his face grave. Gentlemen, this is the most important mission many of you will ever fly. The targets we're hitting today represent the backbone of German logistics in this sector. Success means we accelerate Allied advancement by weeks, maybe months. Failure means German forces remain supplied and capable of resisting our ground offensive. He paused, letting that sink in. You'll be relying on a communication network that was assembled in less than 2 days, using equipment that's older than most of you. It's not ideal, but it's what we have. And the men who built it are the best at what they do. Trust the system, trust your training, and bring everyone home. James climbed into his Lancaster for the 2nd time in a week, feeling the familiar mixture of fear and excitement that preceded every combat mission. His crew was the same as before, men he trusted absolutely. Webb was already at his navigation station, checking coordinates for the 3rd time. "Ready for this?" Webb asked. "No," James admitted, "but we're going anyway." The bombers took off in sequence, rising into an overcast morning sky. James's formation was targeting a rail junction near Malmedy, critical for German supply movements. 2 other formations would hit supply depots, while the remaining 2 would strike fuel storage facilities. As they climbed to altitude and formed up over the channel, James activated his radio link. "Ground Command, this is Formation Alpha Leader. Radio check." The response came through clearly, stronger than it had during the first mission. "Formation Alpha Leader, this is Ground Command. Read you 5 by 5. All other formations report clear communications. Network is functioning within normal parameters." James felt some of his tension ease. Peter's improvised network was working, at least so far. They crossed into Belgian airspace in a loose formation, spreading out to approach their individual targets. James could see other bomber formations in the distance, dark shapes against grey clouds, all heading toward their assigned objectives. It was a massive operation, the largest coordinated strike the squadron had attempted in months. "Formation Alpha Leader, this is Ground Command. Be advised, enemy fighter activity reported in your sector. 12-plus bandits, probably Mi-109s, altitude 18,000 feet, heading northwest." James scanned the sky, searching for the telltale glint of sunlight on canopy glass that would betray enemy fighters. His gunners were already alert, traversing their weapons, ready for combat. "Formation Alpha, close up tight. Gunners, stay sharp." The fighters came in from above and to the right, diving out of the sun in classic German tactics. Tracer fire lit up the sky as the bomber gunners engaged, filling the air with defensive fire. James held his course steady, trusting his gunners to keep the fighters at bay while he focused on reaching the target. One Mi-109 pressed its attack too aggressively, coming within range of multiple gunners. James watched as tracers converged on the fighter, saw pieces of metal tear away from its wing. The German plane spun away, trailing smoke, its pilot fighting for control. "Good shooting," James called over the intercom. "Stay focused. Target in 5 minutes." Through breaks in the clouds, James could see the rail junction, exactly where intelligence had placed it. Trains were visible on the tracks, locomotives and boxcars loaded with supplies. German anti-aircraft positions surrounded the facility, already opening fire, filling the sky with black puffs of flak. "Formation Alpha Leader, this is Ground Command. Target is confirmed hot. No changes to coordinates. You are cleared for bombing run." James lined up his approach, the bomber bucking and shaking as flak burst around them. A piece of shrapnel tore through the fuselage somewhere behind him, but the aircraft remained airworthy. "Bomb bay doors open. Bombardier, target is yours." The bombardier took over, making fine adjustments to the bombing solution, compensating for wind and altitude. James held the aircraft straight and level, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to take evasive action. Bombs away! The Lancaster lurched upward, liberated of its deadly cargo. James banked hard left, following doctrine, and looked back to see other bombers in his formation releasing their loads. Explosions rippled across the rail junction, tearing up tracks, destroying locomotives, igniting supply cars. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition cars cooked off, sending debris hundreds of feet into the air. "Direct hits," Webb reported. "Target is destroyed." "Ground command, Formation Alpha Leader. Target eliminated, proceeding to rally point." "Roger that, Alpha Leader. Good work." Formation Bravo reports similar success on Supply Depot 1. Formation Charlie is on target approach now. The mission continued for another hour as each formation struck its assigned target. The communication network held, carrying coordinates and confirmations, warnings about fighter activity and flak concentrations. James listened to the chatter, heard other formation leaders reporting successes, heard the tension and relief in their voices. One bomber was hit badly during its attack run, losing 2 engines and barely maintaining altitude. The pilot's voice came over the radio, strained but controlled. "This is Baker 4. Heavy damage, engines 1 and 3 out. Attempting to make it back to friendly territory. Baker 4, this is ground command. We have your position. Allied forces are scrambling rescue teams. Try to make it to coordinates 50.2 north, 4.8 east. Emergency landing field there." Peter's voice broke into the channel, something James hadn't expected. "Baker 4, this is Morrison at Base Communications. I'm tracking your position through the network. If you need to set down early, I can coordinate with forward ground units for rescue. Don't try to push it too far." The damaged bomber's pilot sounded grateful. "Roger, Morrison. Thanks for the support." James felt pride swell in his chest. Peter wasn't just maintaining the network, he was actively using it to help save lives, coordinating between air and ground forces in ways that hadn't been possible before. The formation limped home, each aircraft bearing its own scars from combat. 3 bombers had significant damage, including Baker 4, which had managed to reach an emergency landing strip just inside Allied lines. Every crew member survived, pulled from the wreckage by ground forces who had been alerted through Peter's communication network. Landing at Debden felt like waking from a nightmare. The squadron had taken off into uncertainty and returned victorious. All targets destroyed, all aircraft accounted for, no losses. Wing Commander Harrison met them on the runway, his usually stern face showing rare emotion. "Gentlemen, what you accomplished today will be studied in military academies for generations. 5 simultaneous strikes, perfect coordination, complete success. And it all happened because a handful of men refused to accept that there was no way to communicate." The celebration that night was bigger than before, more exuberant. Men who had been certain they wouldn't survive the day now drank and laughed and told impossible stories. But Peter Morrison sat apart again, this time in the communications room, carefully disconnecting and cataloguing the equipment they had used. James found him there, surrounded by wires and junction boxes and radio sets. "You should be celebrating," James said. "I will," Peter replied, not looking up from his work. "But first, I need to document everything we did. How we built the network, what worked, what didn't, so that next time someone can do it better, faster, more reliably. That's how progress happens, Lieutenant. You try something impossible, you succeed or fail, and then you write it down so the next person doesn't have to start from scratch." "Always thinking ahead," James observed. "Always thinking about the wires," Peter corrected with a tired smile. "Wires and connections. That's all life really is when you think about it. Connecting points, carrying signals, making sure the message gets through. Sometimes the wires are copper and rubber, sometimes they're words and actions, but the principle is the same. Every connection matters. Every signal carried makes a difference. James sat down beside him, helping to coil wire. You know they're going to want you to train others to do this, to build these improvised networks. I know. Already got orders to report to communication school next month. Going to teach a whole new generation of engineers how to think outside regulations, how to see possibilities in old systems, how to connect things that aren't supposed to be connected. You'll be good at it, James said. You've got the knowledge and the passion. Maybe, Peter said, but the real skill isn't in knowing how to connect wires. It's in refusing to give up when everyone else says it's impossible. That's what I want to teach them. That sometimes the word impossible just means nobody's tried hard enough yet. 3 days later, James received word that the German counter-offensive they had been warned about never materialized. The supply depot they destroyed had been critical to enemy plans. Without it, the German forces in that sector had no choice but to fall back, giving Allied forces the advantage they needed to continue their advance. Intelligence reports estimated that the first mission had saved between 800 and 1,000 Allied lives, possibly more. The second, larger operation had multiplied that number significantly. Estimates ranged from 2,000 to 3,000 Allied soldiers, who would now survive to push deeper into occupied Europe, who would go home to their families instead of dying in Belgian mud because one sergeant had the knowledge and courage to jury-rig a communication line using civilian infrastructure and a lot of determination. The weeks following the missions brought a flurry of activity. Peter's improvised communication network became the subject of intense study by military communications experts. Engineers arrived from London to examine what he had built, taking notes, asking questions, marveling at the ingenuity of connecting decades-old civilian infrastructure with modern military radio equipment. One of these engineers, a colonel named Brighton with 30 years of experience in military communications, spent an entire afternoon with Peter, going through every junction point, every relay station, every modification Peter had made. This shouldn't work, Brighton said, shaking his head. According to every regulation, every specification, every standard we have, this system should have failed within minutes. The signal degradation alone should have been insurmountable. But it did work, Peter pointed out. Yes, it did. And that's what bothers me. Brighton smiled, though, taking the sting out of his words. It bothers me because it means we've been thinking too rigidly. We've been so focused on building perfect systems that we forgot that sometimes a perfectly adequate system, cobbled together quickly, is better than a perfect system that arrives too late. That's what war teaches you, Peter said. Adequacy in time beats perfection too late. Brighton made more notes. We're going to incorporate this approach into our training programs, not the specific techniques necessarily, but the mindset, teaching our communications officers to think creatively, to see potential in unexpected places, to improvise when standard procedures fail. Just make sure you teach them to understand the fundamentals first, Peter cautioned. You can't improvise effectively unless you truly understand how things work at a basic level. I could build that network because I spent 25 years learning telephone systems inside and out. A younger engineer without that foundation might have made critical errors. Good point, Brighton agreed. Fundamentals first, improvisation second. The recognition continued to accumulate. Peter Morrison received the Distinguished Flying Medal in a quiet ceremony at the airfield. He stood at attention while Wing Commander Harrison pinned the medal to his uniform, looking profoundly uncomfortable with the honor. James stood with the other officers, proud of the man who had made everything possible. But the medal ceremony was followed by something unexpected. Corporal Davies, promoted to sergeant for his role in maintaining the first communication line, stood beside Peter as Harrison addressed the assembled personnel. "Gentlemen," Harrison began, "we often celebrate the pilots who fly the missions, and rightly so. They face death every time they take to the sky. But this war is won by thousands of men whose names never appear in newspapers, whose faces never grace magazine covers. Men who solve problems quietly, who work in obscurity, who use skill and determination to make the impossible possible. Sergeant Morrison and Sergeant Davies represent all those unseen heroes. Their actions saved thousands of lives. They did it without fanfare, without seeking recognition, simply because it was the right thing to do, and they had the skills to do it." The assembled personnel applauded, and Peter felt his face flush with embarrassment. This wasn't why he had done it. He hadn't been seeking glory or recognition. He had simply seen a problem and used his knowledge to solve it. After the ceremony, as people dispersed back to their duties, an unexpected visitor approached Peter. He was a civilian, middle-aged, wearing a well-tailored suit that seemed out of place on a military airfield. "Sergeant Morrison," the man said, extending his hand. "My name is Reginald Thompson. I'm with the Post Office headquarters in London." Peter shook his hand, confused. "Sir, if this is about me using post office equipment without authorization, I can explain." Thompson laughed. No, nothing like that. Actually, I'm here to thank you. Your innovative use of our pre-war infrastructure has attracted attention at the highest levels. We've been approached by the military asking if similar networks could be established in other locations as backup communication systems for critical operations. "It's possible," Peter said cautiously, "but it would require men who understand both the civilian telephone systems and military communication needs. Not many people have that combination of skills, which is why we'd like to offer you a position after the war," Thompson said. "Head of Infrastructure Innovation. Your job would be to identify ways our existing systems could be adapted for emergency use, both military and civilian. Think about it, Sergeant. London has thousands of miles of telephone cables, old systems that date back to Victorian times. What if another crisis arises? What if we need rapid communication during an emergency? Your experience could be invaluable." Peter was stunned. "I'm just a mechanic, sir, a telephone engineer." "You're a man who sees possibilities where others see obstacles," Thompson corrected. "That's exactly what we need. Think about it. The offer will be waiting when the war ends." That evening, James found Peter sitting alone in the mess hall, staring at a cup of tea that had gone cold. "You all right?" James asked, sitting down across from him. "I've been thinking," Peter said slowly, "about connections, about how everything in life is really just about connecting things, people, places, ideas. That's what I do with telephone wires, connect voices across distances, but it's more than that, isn't it? Every connection we make, every link we establish, it changes things. It makes things possible that weren't possible before." "Philosophy?" James asked with a slight smile. "That's not like you, Peter." "Maybe the war is making me philosophical," Peter replied. "Or maybe I'm just tired. But I keep thinking about all the connections that had to work for those missions to succeed. The connection between me and my knowledge of telephone systems. The connection between you and Wing Commander Harrison's trust. The connections between all those junction points and relay stations. The connection between air and ground forces. Remove any one of those connections, and everything fails. That's true of everything," James said. "That's what makes us human, Peter. We're not isolated individuals. We're parts of a vast network, all interconnected, all dependent on each other. You just made those connections more literal." Peter smiled, his first genuine smile in days. "I suppose I did. And you know what? I think I'm going to take that post office job when the war ends. Keep making connections, keep finding ways to link things together. It's what I'm good at. It's what I'm meant to do." The months that followed brought more missions, more challenges, more opportunities for Peter to demonstrate his unique skills. He trained other engineers in his techniques, created detailed manuals documenting the improvised networks he had built. The knowledge spread through the RAF and beyond, reaching other Allied forces. In March 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, Peter's communication techniques played a crucial role in coordinating the crossing of the Rhine. Multiple bomber formations, ground forces, and naval support all communicated through a network that combined military and civilian infrastructure, built hastily but effectively using the principles Peter had pioneered. James flew that mission, watching from his cockpit as thousands of troops crossed the river while aircraft provided cover above. The coordination was flawless, the communication crystal clear. He thought about Peter, probably somewhere in a communications room, monitoring signals, making adjustments, ensuring that every connection held strong. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, James was in his quarters when he heard the news. He walked out onto the airfield and found Peter there, standing alone, looking at the bombers that would no longer fly combat missions. "It's over," James said simply. "For now," Peter replied. "But there's still work to do. Rebuilding, reconnecting, making sure all the broken links get repaired. That's going to take years. But we don't have to do it while people are shooting at us," James pointed out. Peter laughed, a sound James hadn't heard in months. "True. That's a definite improvement." They stood together in silence, watching the sun set over the airfield, thinking about all they had seen, all they had done, all the connections they had made that had helped win a war. "What will you do?" James asked. "After you're discharged?" "Take that post office job," Peter said. "Work on improving emergency communication systems, maybe teach at a technical college on the side, pass on what I've learned. What about you?" "Keep flying," James said. "Not combat missions, hopefully. But I can't imagine not flying. Maybe commercial aviation, connecting cities and countries, different kind of connection, but still important." "Everything's about connections," Peter said quietly. "That's what I've learned from all this. The war, the missions, everything. We're only as strong as the links between us. Break those links and we fall apart. Maintain them, strengthen them, and we can accomplish anything." Peter Morrison received the Distinguished Flying Medal in a quiet ceremony at the airfield. He stood at attention while Wing Commander Harrison pinned the medal to his uniform, looking uncomfortable with the honor. James stood with the other officers, proud of the man who had made everything possible. "The thing about Morrison," Harrison said privately to James after the ceremony, "is that he represents something essential about winning this war. It's not just about the pilots and the planes and the bombs. It's about the thousands of men like him, working in obscurity, using whatever skills they have to solve problems nobody else can solve. The mechanics, the engineers, the radio operators, the cooks keeping everyone fed. They're all heroes, every one of them." In January 1945, Corporal Davies was promoted to sergeant for his role in maintaining the communication line. The young man wrote a letter to Peter Morrison, thanking him for the opportunity and for teaching him that sometimes the most important thing you can do in a war is stand in a cold building and keep a connection alive for 2 hours. James Hartford continued flying missions through the end of the war. He survived 38 combat operations and was eventually promoted to squadron leader. But no mission was ever quite as memorable as that December day when a cancelled operation became a success because one man refused to accept defeat. The jury-rigged communication line was eventually replaced with proper military infrastructure, but the story of what Peter Morrison had accomplished spread through the RAF and beyond. It became a lesson taught to new engineers and communications specialists. Sometimes the solution to an impossible problem requires looking outside standard procedures, using old knowledge in new ways, and having the courage to try something that might not work. After the war, Peter returned to Manchester and resumed his work with the post office, running telephone lines, connecting people, doing the quiet work that makes civilization possible. He rarely talked about his wartime service, about the medal in his drawer, about the day he helped save hundreds of lives with copper wire and determination. But sometimes, late at night, he would think about that cold December day in Dover, about the young corporal maintaining the connection, about the bombers flying toward their target, about all the men who came home because one seemingly impossible idea actually worked. James visited him once in 1947, making the trip to Manchester to see how his old friend was doing. They shared a pint in a local pub, talking about everything except the war. But as James was leaving, Peter grabbed his arm. "Do you ever think about it?" Peter asked. "About that day?" "Every time I fly," James admitted. "Every time I see a telephone wire." "Me too," Peter said. "Every single day. I think about all the connections that had to work, all the things that could have gone wrong. And I think about how sometimes the difference between victory and defeat is just one person willing to try something everyone else thinks is impossible." They shook hands, two men who had shared something profound, something that would connect them for the rest of their lives. Then James walked away, disappearing into the Manchester evening, while Peter returned to his family, to his ordinary life, to the quiet heroism of everyday existence. Years passed. The war became history, then distant history, then something elderly men talked about with younger generations who couldn't quite grasp what it had been like. Peter and James stayed in touch through letters and occasional visits, maintaining their own connection across the years. Peter's work at the post office flourished. He developed emergency communication protocols that would prove invaluable during the London fog crisis of 1952, when thick smog brought the city to a standstill, and emergency services needed reliable ways to coordinate. His systems, based on redundant connections and improvised backups, kept vital communications functioning when newer, more sophisticated systems failed. He also taught at a technical college 2 evenings a week, passing on his knowledge to young engineers who had never known war but who understood the importance of reliable communication. In his classes, he told stories about the war, not to glorify it, but to illustrate principles of problem-solving, creativity, and perseverance. "The real lesson," he would tell his students, "isn't about telephone wires or radio equipment. It's about how you think when facing an impossible problem. Do you give up because the textbook says it can't be done? Or do you ask yourself what might be possible if you think differently, if you combine old and new in unexpected ways, if you're willing to take calculated risks?" His students loved him. He was patient, knowledgeable, and possessed a rare ability to explain complex technical concepts in simple terms. But more than that, he taught them something beyond technical skills. He taught them resilience, creativity, and the courage to attempt things that seemed impossible. James's career in commercial aviation took him around the world. He flew routes across Europe, to Africa, to Asia, seeing countries rebuild after the war, watching new connections form between nations that had been enemies. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now creating peaceful connections where once there had been only destruction. He wrote to Peter regularly, describing his flights, the places he saw, the passengers he carried. "We're still connecting things," he wrote in one letter, "but now it's families reuniting, business people building trade relationships, travelers experiencing new cultures. Different connections than the ones you make with telephone wires, but just as important. Maybe more important because they're about bringing people together rather than coordinating military operations." Peter kept all of James's letters, treasuring them as proof that peaceful connections were possible, that the work they had done during the war had helped create a world where such peace could exist. In 1960, Peter received an unexpected visitor at his home in Manchester. It was a young German man, perhaps 30 years old, well-dressed and speaking careful English with a thick accent. "Herr Morrison?" the man asked nervously. "My name is Klaus Hartmann. I was told you might be able to help me understand something about the war." Peter invited him in, curious and slightly wary. The war had been over for 15 years, but emotions could still run high. Klaus sat in Peter's living room, holding a cup of tea with shaking hands. "My father," he began, "was a supply officer with the Wehrmacht during the war. He was stationed at a depot near the Belgian border in December 1944. One day, British bombers came and destroyed everything. My father survived, but many of his men did not." Peter felt his chest tighten. He knew which bombing raid Klaus was referring to, the first mission, the one that had started everything. "I'm sorry for your loss," Peter said quietly. "That is not why I am here," Klaus continued. "After the war, my father became a pacifist. He dedicated his life to peace, to building connections between former enemies. He worked for reconciliation between Germany and Britain. But he always wondered about that bombing raid. It was so precise, so well coordinated. He said it was as if the British had perfect intelligence about the depot, perfect communication between air and ground forces. He wondered how you had managed it when the German forces had been told that British communications in that sector were in disarray. Peter didn't know what to say. This man's father had been the enemy, had been part of the military machine they had been fighting. Yet hearing about his father's later work for peace, Peter felt a strange kinship. "Communication," Peter finally said, "is about making connections. Sometimes those connections are used for war, but they can also be used for peace, for understanding, for building bridges between people who were once enemies." Klaus nodded slowly. "My father passed away last year. Before he died, he asked me to find someone who had been involved in that bombing raid, to tell them that he understood, that he bore no grudge, that the war was a terrible thing, but both sides were doing what they believed was necessary. He wanted me to say, 'Thank you.'" "Thank you?" Peter was confused. "Thank you," Klaus said, "because that bombing raid, that perfectly coordinated strike, it ended the war faster in our sector. It meant fewer men died on both sides. My father calculated that if the war in that region had dragged on another month, another 2 months, the casualties would have been enormous on both sides. Your precise strike shortened the war. It saved lives, German lives as well as British." Peter felt tears forming in his eyes. He had never thought about it that way. He had always focused on the Allied lives saved, never considering that by ending the fighting faster, they had also saved enemy lives. "I never knew," Peter said softly. "My father wanted you to know," Klaus said. "He wanted someone to understand that the connections you made, the work you did, it mattered in ways you probably never imagined. Not just for your side, but for everyone. War is terrible, but war that drags on is worse. You helped end it faster. That was a gift to all of us." After Klaus left, Peter sat alone for a long time, thinking about connections, about how they ripple outward in ways we can never fully predict or understand. He had connected wires and circuits so that bombers could find their targets, but in doing so, he had also connected past and future, enemy and friend, war and peace. He wrote to James that evening, telling him about Klaus's visit. "I always thought of our work during the war as something separate from the peace that followed," he wrote. "But maybe it's not separate at all. Maybe every connection we make, even the ones made during war, contributes to the eventual peace. Maybe that's the real lesson, that connections matter, all of them, even the difficult ones, even the painful ones." In 1965, 20 years after the war's end, Peter and James were both invited to a reunion of RAF Debden veterans. It was held at the old airfield, which had been partially converted to civilian use but still retained much of its wartime character. The operations building, where James had first seen that red cancelled stamp, still stood, though it was now used for storage. Peter stood in the old communications room, now empty and dusty, remembering the equipment that had once filled these walls, the voices that had crackled through speakers, the desperate urgency of war. "Takes you back, doesn't it?" James said, joining him. 20 years, Peter said, shaking his head. "Feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago at the same time." "A lot has changed," James observed. "Communication technology has advanced incredibly. Satellites, transistors, computers. What you did with that old post office equipment seems almost primitive now. But the principle remains the same," Peter said. "Connect points, carry signals, ensure the message gets through. The technology changes, but the fundamental need for communication never does." They walked outside, where other veterans were gathering, grey-haired men who had once been young and terrified and brave. There were speeches, remembrances, toasts to fallen comrades. The mood was bittersweet, celebrating survival while honouring those who hadn't made it home. Wing Commander Harrison was there, now in his 70s, walking with 2 canes but still possessing the same sharp eyes and stern expression. He approached Peter and James, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. "Morrison, Hartford. Good to see you both. I've been following your careers." "Morrison, I hear your emergency communication protocols saved lives during that London fog business." "Hartford, I'm told you're one of the most respected commercial pilots in the fleet. You've both done well." "We learned from the best, sir," James said. "Nonsense," Harrison replied. "You taught yourselves. That's what made you valuable. You didn't wait for orders or permission. You saw what needed to be done and did it. That's the kind of thinking that wins wars and builds better peacetimes." At one point, a young reporter approached Peter and James, asking about their wartime service. When he heard about the improvised communication network, his eyes lit up. "That's an incredible story," the reporter said. "Mind if I write about it?" Peter started to demur, but James interrupted. "Write about it. But make sure you emphasize that it wasn't just one man's achievement. It was a team effort. Davies maintaining the line in Dover, Mitchell and the other engineers working the junction points, the pilots trusting the system, the ground forces coordinating their movements. Every connection mattered. Remove any one person, and it all falls apart." The reporter took notes eagerly. "What would you say was the most important lesson from that experience?" Peter and James looked at each other, then Peter spoke. "That impossible is usually just difficult in disguise. When everyone told us the mission couldn't go forward because the communication line was severed, we could have accepted that. Could have said, well, we tried, nothing more we can do. Instead, we looked for another way, used old systems in new configurations, took risks that might not have worked. And because we were willing to try, thousands of men survived who otherwise wouldn't have." "So, persistence?" the reporter asked. "Persistence," Peter agreed, "and knowledge and creativity and willingness to think beyond standard procedures, all of those things together. Any one of them alone wouldn't have been enough." James added, "And trust. Trust in each other, trust in the system, trust that even when things look impossible, human ingenuity can find a way. That's what won the war, really. Not superior technology or numbers, though those helped. It was the willingness of thousands of people like Peter to look at impossible problems and say, let me try something." The article appeared in several newspapers a few weeks later, bringing renewed attention to the story. Peter received letters from veterans thanking him for his service, from engineering students asking for advice, from historians wanting more details about the technical aspects of what he had built. He answered every letter personally, carefully explaining the technical challenges, the solutions he had implemented, the lessons learned. But he always emphasized the collaborative nature of the achievement, always made sure to mention Davies and the other engineers, the pilots who had trusted the system, the ground forces who had coordinated their actions based on the information transmitted. One letter came from Davies himself, now a senior engineer with British Telecom, working on the early development of what would eventually become Internet protocols. "I still think about those hours in Dover," Davies wrote, "maintaining that connection while bombers depended on it. It taught me something fundamental about communication systems. They're not just technical constructs, they're lifelines. Every connection carries not just signals, but human hopes, human needs, sometimes human survival. That understanding has shaped my entire career. Thank you for teaching me that lesson." De Peter wrote back immediately, telling Davies that he had been the true hero of that day, that his steady hands and calm competence under pressure had been what made everything possible. "You were 20 years old," Peter wrote, "alone in a cold building, responsible for keeping men alive through the quality of your work. That's a burden that would have broken many men, but you carried it with grace and skill. I'm proud to have known you then, and I'm proud to know you now." The correspondence continued over the years. Davies would share technical innovations he was working on, and Peter would offer insights based on his decades of experience. It was a professional relationship that had grown into genuine friendship, bonded by shared experience and mutual respect. In 1970, Peter retired from the post office after 45 years of service. His retirement party was attended by hundreds of people, including James, who flew in from Africa, where he had been delivering medical supplies to a remote region. The war had taught them both that heroes aren't always the ones in the spotlight, the ones flying the missions or leading the charges. Sometimes heroes are the ones who see a problem, understand what needs to be done, and have the knowledge and courage to do it, even when everyone else has given up. Sometimes heroes are telephone engineers who remember how the old systems work. Sometimes the difference between winning and losing is one person who refuses to accept that the mission is cancelled, who sees a different path, who takes a chance on an old wire and a crazy idea. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything, and sometimes that's enough.